Hey guys, we just got through the Christmas holidays. I hope you had a wonderful time. During the Christmas holidays, we had some friends and family over. We all wanted to watch a Christmas movie, and so instead of watching It's a Wonderful Life, we watched a legacy video from 3 years ago. That's right, we did one. It's actually a story about faith and forgiveness, and we throw in a gun, which is a baby Nambu. We only had about 5,000 people watch it back when we first got started. Now we have 100,000 subscribers who have never seen it, and it's one of my favorites. Please check it out. I came across this war story, and let me tell you a little bit about how I came across it. I was doing a video about a gun. It was actually a baby Nambu that was carried by a pilot. There was documentation that it was carried by a pilot. You can see a quick picture of this, and this is a separate video. Make sure you watch that one. I was going to combine it with this story because it's a pilot story, a Japanese pilot story, and I figured it was so good that it needed a video all by itself, plus it's Christmas week, and this war story is filled with little Christmas miracles. Now, it is a timeless story, so no matter when you're watching it, I think it's something you'll remember for a long time. So in the thumbnail, which a lot of people use as clickbait, we have pictures of two men. One is a Japanese flyer, and he led the attack at Pearl Harbor. And then we have an American flyer who was part of the Doolittle raid. And the story is about these two men, how they became closest of friends. How does that happen? That's our war story that I want to tell you today. So our story starts with Mitsuo Fuchida. I hope I'm saying that right, but he was born in 1902, obviously in Japan, and he went to the Japanese Naval Academy. As a sidelight, he might have been given a baby Nambu. We have no record of the gun that he carried, but we know a lot of the cadets at the Japanese War College and the Naval Academy, many of them were given baby Nambus. So that's where it really started my search on this story, is to find out what kind of gun he carried. And then I learned more and more about this guy, and I just had to tell you about him. So he started off as a flyer in the war in 1939. He was part of the campaign against China, and then also throughout Indochina, they attacked the British and Dutch colonies. In the Chinese campaign, he actually distinguished himself as a leader and a flyer, and therefore he was chosen to lead the raid and Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. As a matter of fact, he was a prolific writer, and so in leading the raid at Pearl Harbor, he actually kept his notes, and later that was used in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. If you watch that movie in the very beginning, it says the infamous battle at Pearl Harbor, as told by both the Japanese side and the American side. He did a lot of writing from the Japanese side of what it was like to have attacked Pearl Harbor, and that was used in the movie Tora, 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 and also the movie Pearl Harbor. So here's a few scenes from both Pearl Harbor and Tora, 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 where Fuchida is prominently displayed throughout both movies during the attack.
ご覧ください。全員意気健康。この時に備えてきたんです。我奇襲に成功せり。こらとはとや。は。長官、トラトラトラです。トラトラトラです。
These movies were actually made from the actual facts that he wrote down later. His crew chief is seen here giving him a bandana that read certain victory. And then as he led the attack, there were two other crewmen with him. He was the crew chief. He actually stayed over the target for the first raid, and when the first raid went back, he continued to stay over the target and taking notes, and stayed until the second wave was done, and then he went back to the ship, which was the aircraft carrier Akagi. Those of you who know the movie Tora Tora Tora, those were the infamous words that he used to signal back to the aircraft carrier that the attack was a complete surprise, and that that part of the campaign was successful in that they caught the Americans off guard. And then, of course, from a Japanese perspective, it was a complete victory. As an aside, he actually went back to the ship and drew a diagram of the destruction of the American fleet. And recently, that diagram, shown here, was sold on auction for over $400,000. After leading the attack on Pearl Harbor, Fuchida went back to Japan, where he was hailed as a hero. He actually got a private audience with the emperor, which is a super big deal. And he was continued in more campaigns throughout China and Indochina. His next big venture was the Battle of Midway. Again, a recent movie, but the Battle of Midway was a turning point in the war, where he continued to serve with basically the same crew that had bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, most of you know the Battle of Midway went a much different direction, in that the United States kind of knew ahead of time that they were going to attack Midway. An incredible war story about how naval intelligence was able to crack the code and figure out that the Japanese were coming, and they were ready for them. Our aircraft carriers against their aircraft carriers, and it was a turning point in the war, in that every major battle before Midway was won by the Japanese, and every major battle beyond that was won by the Americans. So it really was. Midway was an island midway in the Pacific, but it was also the turning point of the war. So Fuchida was in that battle as well. And he actually recorded from the Japanese side. He took many notes that were used later by American historians. In that battle, he missed the being able to fly with his crew because of emergency surgery, appendectomy. He was not able to fly. He, however, was wounded in that battle because a bomb hit his ship, the Akagi, and he was wounded in that battle. Later, it was scuttled by the Japanese because it was so badly damaged, it wasn't going to make it back to Japan. They knew that the ship would be captured by the Americans, so they scuttled the ship. He was transferred to another ship and finally made it back to Japan. So now wounded, Fuchida makes it back to Japan, where his wounds kind of keep him in an administrative role with the naval hierarchy. And he was stationed, or his hometown was in Hiroshima, of all places. And just before the bomb dropped, again, a Christmas miracle, just before the bomb drops, the day before, he's called back to Tokyo for a meeting, and the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. He then joins a crew the day after the bomb is dropped. There's a group of Army and Navy officers who go to see the destruction, trying to figure out what is this new weapon that the Americans have. And so he went with a team of people the day after the explosion, and they toured the city. He's heartbroken because many of his friends and family lived in that city, and that was basically his hometown. So he's heartbroken from the destruction. And just to add insult to injury, the team that he went with, as he writes the story later, he said every one of those members of that team died of radiation poisoning within a short period of time, except for him. He actually showed no symptoms at all of radiation poisoning, even though he was with the team the day after the bombing. So in August, September of 1945, the war is now over. And Fuchida is actually called to come and testify at some of the war crimes trials. Now, in researching this a little bit, what was that about? Was he on trial for war crimes? It doesn't seem that he was on trial, but he was more or less forced to come in and testify in the trials because the Americans wanted to go after the hierarchy who ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not so much the rank and file, like he was a commander and led the raid, but he's following orders. So from my research, it seems that he was called in to testify to confirm who actually gave the order or who led the attack. And they were doing this as part of their, after the war crimes trials. Now, in his own words, he was very much against this. He didn't want to testify. He thought it was a lot of baloney because at that point, and what he writes is, there was atrocities on both sides. I mean, he's witnessed Hiroshima. He's seen a lot of destruction, and his point of view was both the Americans and the Japanese did a lot of terrible things during the war. We were equally responsible, and he really deeply resented being called in and being made to testify against his countrymen. It was during the time of these trials, which is actually 1946. He heard about some of the Japanese prisoners coming home. Now, his co-pilots, the guys that he served with, many of them he thought were dead. But in fact, they were captured, they were shot down and then rescued from the water by the Americans and put in prisoner of war camps. So he went to meet his friends. It was a really happy reunion because, again, he thought these guys were dead, and he sees them. So in these meetings with his fellow pilots, guys that he had served with, and expecting to hear horror stories about how they were treated by the Americans, he in fact hears stories about how the Americans were very kind to them. In fact, they tell a story about a woman named Peggy Covell who actually helped them. She nursed the wounded, she fed the sick, she made sure they were taken care of, and she told them an incredible story about her own life and told her about a story of love and forgiveness being part of her Christian faith. So allow me to pause this part of the story just for a minute and bring in a little bit of Peggy, because she is actually an American hero, in my opinion, and a hero of the faith, in that she grew up in Japan as a Christian missionary. There's a picture of her family in Japan. They were there and they ministered to the people of Japan before the war. In 1939, things became so bad between Japan and the United States. They're not at war yet, but there's an embargo against Japan because they attacked China. So they've broken trade. There's a lot of really bad feeling. And so her parents felt like they had to get out of Japan. So in 1939, they fled to the Philippines. In fact, Peggy graduated from high school in Manila. And then her family, seeing all the tensions and wanting her to go to college, they sent their children to the United States for education, and they stayed in the Philippines. They actually were stationed in Manila, and as you probably know, within a week of the Pearl Harbor raid, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and by 1942, they take Manila. Now, her mom and dad then flee to the mountains. They go into the jungles with a group of about 100 Christians, Filipino Christians, part of a small church community. They're living in the woods. They survive for a little over a year. When the Japanese catch up to them, they round them all up and sentence them all to death as American spies. The Covells, mom and dad, asked for a half an hour to read the Bible and pray. And the Japanese granted that request and then executed them by beheading. They executed all 100 of the people in that village, including the men, the women, and the children, all of them beheaded. Now, Peggy didn't find out what happened to her family until sometime later. And of course, when she heard this story, she was filled with anger toward the Japanese and what they had done. But she very quickly realized that her family her mom and dad asking to pray, she said, in her own writing says, I know she was praying for the people who executed her, because that's what Jesus did before he went to the cross. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And so because of her Christian love, her Christian faith, she volunteers to go to the prisoner of war camp in Utah and minister to the Japanese soldiers. She speaks Japanese. She preaches to them and helps the wounded and feeds the sick. So she ministers to them, and because of that, several of the Japanese captors actually became Christians, go back to Japan, and that's where they run into Fuchida. Now, back to Fuchida, his reaction to this, and again, this is his own words, it's not my story, this is his story. He's written several books about this story. He said he was obsessed with getting to, like, this was mind-blowing to him, because he said, I grew up in a Bushido code, which was you kill your enemies, you never surrender. And if somebody does something to you, like kills your mom and dad, you are obligated to seek revenge against those people. And here he was hearing this story, this counter culture to his, that basically says, love your enemies. So he said it just blew his mind. He was obsessed with learning more. What in the world is going on with my friends and these people who have converted to Christianity? So he begins to seek answers. Now we're going to put a pin in this story again and bring in a third character, which is Jacob de Shazer. Now he's the flyer that was pictured in the thumbnail that I already mentioned, who was part of the Doolittle raid. So let's talk a little bit about his life. He is also a pilot. He joined the Air Corps in 1940, so before Pearl Harbor, he joins the Air Corps. He volunteers for the Doolittle raid. He didn't know what the raid was, but it was a secret mission, and there were all the men who went on this mission volunteered. He was obviously a very good airman. And he is in the Doolittle raid, which those of you who don't know, that was where the B-25 bombers took off from aircraft carriers. They had to take off a little bit early because they realized the Japanese discovered that they were approaching Japan. And so they went ahead and launched the planes about 100 miles further away from Japan than they really wanted to. So the bottom line was they dropped their bombs, but many of them didn't make it. They ended up crashing in China. The goal was to get past the Japanese territory. The Japanese had conquered the eastern portion of China, but the mid and western portions of China was held by the Chinese, and the Americans pilots were hoping to make it to the Chinese territory, and many of them did not. This is actually not this actual story of Jacob, but this is portrayed in the movie Pearl Harbor. If you remember, I think it's Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett that are shot down, and they end up in the Chinese section. And you can see what happens in terms of one of them being killed and one of them living to the end of the war. But that's what happened to Jacob. He came down in Japanese occupied territory, and as you probably know, the Japanese were incredibly angry about what the Americans had done. They had not only bombed Tokyo, but Jacob actually, he dropped his bombs on the city of Nagoya, Japan, which was news to me. I thought they only attacked Tokyo, but they attacked some other cities. So he dropped his bombs. He crash lands in China, and 2 of his crew were executed by firing squad, and then 1 other of his crew starved to death in the prisoner of war camps. He was put in solitary confinement, and again, according to his own story, his words were he was tortured and starved and beaten almost daily in solitary confinement for over a year. And during that time, he asked from his guards for a Bible. They weren't allowed to have any books, but they were allowed to have a Bible, and so he asked for a Bible, which he was given for a period of 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, he read the Bible, and he was particularly impressed where in the Gospels where Jesus talks about loving your enemies. And so he converted to Christianity. And from that point on, he said he just tried to really love his enemies. And according to him, his treatment after that point became better and better. He was rescued from China by American paratroopers who came in and freed the prisoners of war. He came back to the United States, where he decided to be a preacher, and later went to Japan, to the city of Nagoya, and started a church among the Japanese people. All right, well, we're full of Christmas miracles here, but let's go back to Fuchida and find out what happens to him. He's in a second war crime trial. After the first war crime trial, that's where he first heard about Peggy Covell. And then sometime later, it seems like it was several months later, he was part of another war crimes trial and brought in to testify. And he mentions that he's going to the courthouse. So right somewhere in the city, on the steps of the courthouse, somebody is handing out Christian tracts. Basically, these are pamphlets, which would be testimonials. And in this particular one was the story of Jacob de Shazer. And so, of course, he'd already had his mind blown by the life of Peggy and what she had done. And now he's reading this story about this guy who was beaten and tortured in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And now he's preaching the gospel. And he's reads this story, goes back and begins to read the Bible for himself. And long story short, he converts to Christianity. He then goes back to the United States because he wants to meet Jacob. And as he tells the story, he goes to Jacob's house, knocks on the door and says, "Sir, I've been wanting to meet you." And they become lifelong friends from that point on. So to wrap up this war story / Christmas miracle story, they become close friends, and Fuchida and Jacob de Cesar end up traveling together around the United States and also in Japan, where Jacob ends up as a missionary for 30 years. He lives to the ripe old age of 97, by the way. He died in 2008. And Fuchida actually traveled with Billy Graham for a while, gave his testimony in Billy Graham crusades. And doing the research to this story, it reminded me that I heard this story once before as a young boy. I think my father was watching Billy Graham on TV and heard this testimonial, a story I long forgot until I began to research it for this video. So in summary, this war story is about the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who converted to Christianity, moved to the United States, and preached a message of love and forgiveness. And hey guys, it doesn't get any better than that. Merry Christmas.